It was a quiet evening when it all began. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street as the man walked his dog through the neighborhood. It was a routine they shared, one that had become a comforting ritual after years of chaos. The dog, a large, protective breed, walked beside him, always alert, always loyal. The bond between them was strong, formed not only by the years they had spent together, but by the shared experiences that only someone with his background could truly understand. He had once been part of something much bigger, a member of a secretive and elite military unit known for handling the toughest of situations. Delta Force, a place where only the best survived, where every mission was a life-or-death struggle, and where strength and discipline were paramount. But that was all behind him now. After years of service, he had walked away, seeking peace and a new life. But peace was not always easy to find. As he strolled through the quiet neighborhood, the weight of his past lingered in the back of his mind, but it didn't control him anymore. He had done his part, sacrificed things that most would never understand, and now he had the freedom to live quietly with his dog. They had both earned it. The neighborhood was calm and everything seemed peaceful. It wasn't a particularly busy time of day, but as they turned a corner, the man noticed a police car parked on the side of the road. At first, he didn't think much of it. Police officers were a common sight in any neighborhood, especially in the evenings. But something felt off. He kept walking, his dog's ears perked up as it sensed something in the air. The dog, despite being well-trained, was always on edge in unfamiliar situations. The man gave a small, reassuring pat to the dog's head, trying to ease its growing tension. The car sat there stationary, and for a moment, everything seemed still. But then, as they drew closer, the officer inside the car started to move. The officer's eyes scanned the street before locking onto the man. A brief flash of recognition, or perhaps suspicion, passed over the officer's face. The dog, sensing the unease, suddenly growled low in its throat. The officer, startled by the dog's reaction, quickly got out of the car. In the quiet of the street, every sound seemed amplified. The dog's growl, the shuffle of boots on the pavement, the rustle of leaves in the trees. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" The officer's voice was sharp, commanding, but there was something off about it. The man didn't respond immediately. He stood still, assessing the situation. His instincts kicked in, and the quiet, calculated part of him took over. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty in the officer's stance. "What's the problem, officer?" the man asked, his voice calm, steady. The officer hesitated, his hand moving to his holster as if unsure whether to speak or act. The dog's growl deepened, its body tensing as it positioned itself protectively between the man and the officer. "You're in the area late, and we've had reports of suspicious activity," the officer said, trying to sound authoritative. "I need you to show me some ID." The man's eyes flicked to the officer's hand on his weapon. He knew the situation could escalate quickly, but he also knew how to handle pressure. "Everything is fine," he replied evenly. "Just walking my dog. We live here." The officer took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "I don't like your tone. Keep the dog back." The man felt a shift in the air. Something was wrong. The officer was no longer just questioning him. He was treating him like a threat, one that needed to be controlled. The dog growled again, but the man gave a subtle hand gesture, signaling the dog to stay calm. Still, the dog wasn't having it. The protective instincts were kicking in hard, and it wasn't backing down. At that moment, another squad car appeared, its headlights flashing in the growing dusk. The man's senses were on high alert now. He had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when things were about to go sideways. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. He could feel it. The first officer took another step forward, and that was when everything unraveled. Suddenly, the dog lunged, reacting to what it saw as a threat to its owner. The officer, startled, raised his weapon, his eyes wide with fear. The dog, now fully in defense mode, charged toward him. The man reacted instinctively, reaching out to hold the dog back. But before he could even react fully, a gunshot rang out. The loud, jarring noise echoed through the street. It was followed by a cry from the dog as it stumbled back, wounded. The man froze. The officer had shot his dog. Time seemed to slow as the man rushed forward, ignoring everything else, ignoring the officer's warnings. His mind was a blur, his thoughts focused only on his dog. He dropped to his knees beside the animal, cradling its head in his lap. The dog's breathing was shallow, its body trembling as blood slowly soaked into the pavement. Why? The word escaped the man's lips before he even realized he had spoken. The officer, now wide-eyed with regret and fear, didn't know what to say. He could see the anger in the man's eyes, but more than that, he saw something else. A quiet, almost eerie calm that made his stomach churn. He had no idea who this man was or what he might be capable of. The officer fumbled for words, his voice shaky. I didn't mean to— Shut up, the man snapped, his voice cold. He continued to hold his dog, the bond they shared palpable in the moment. But the man's mind was already racing, his training kicking in. His dog was dead, and with it a piece of him. But he wasn't just any man, and the officer had no idea what he had just done. The man sat in silence, his dog's lifeless body in his lap, as the officer stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The street, once peaceful, felt tense and heavy, the sound of distant traffic and the soft rustling of leaves the only noises breaking the stillness. He could feel his heart pounding, the rage building in him, but his mind was calm, methodical, processing everything with precision. The officer had made a mistake. A dangerous one. But the man knew there was more at play here than just a simple error in judgment. He had been in enough dangerous situations to recognize when things had gone too far, when people failed to see the full picture. The dog, his loyal companion, had been more than just a pet. It had been his partner in a world that most people could never imagine, a world of missions and operations that required the highest level of trust and loyalty. To lose the dog now in such a senseless way felt like losing a part of himself. Still, he didn't react with violence or anger. His training had taught him to remain controlled, to think before acting. The officer's hands were still shaking, his gun now lowered as he looked at the man, his eyes filled with regret and confusion. "I didn't mean for this to happen," the officer stammered. I was just following protocol. You didn't listen when I told you to stop." The man didn't respond right away. He just kept looking down at the dog, his fingers gently brushing the fur as he tried to process what had just happened. This wasn't the first time he had been caught in a tense situation, but this was different. This time it wasn't a mission or a war zone. This was supposed to be peace. This was supposed to be the life he had fought for. "I'll call an ambulance," the officer said, his voice shaky as he reached for his radio. The man didn't hear him. His focus was on the dog, on the loss. But then, his mind shifted back to the officer. This was no longer just about the dog. This was about the bigger picture, the consequences of a world that misunderstood, that failed to recognize the complexity of the man standing before them. The officer had no idea who he was, no idea what he had been through, no idea that the man who stood before him had spent years in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable, facing enemies that would break most people. And yet, here he was on the receiving end of an officer's fear-driven mistake. The man's hand tightened around the dog's fur, but he didn't move. He wasn't going to make a scene. He wouldn't make things worse. He would do things his way, calmly, methodically. But it didn't mean he would forget. It didn't mean there wouldn't be consequences. After a few moments of silence, the man finally spoke, his voice calm but cold. "You don't know who I am, do you?" The officer froze, his hand hovering over the radio as he looked at the man, confused. "What do you mean?" The man's gaze never left the officer's face. "You've made a mistake," he said softly, "and now you're going to have to live with it. But it's not just about the dog. It's about what you don't understand." The officer shifted nervously, glancing at the other police car that had arrived at the scene, its lights flashing but offering no real help in the situation. He was starting to realize that maybe he had underestimated the situation, but he still had no idea who this man was. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" the officer started again, but the man cut him off. "Don't say you're sorry," the man said, his voice sharp now. "It won't bring him back." He motioned to the dog, whose body was still cradled in his lap. "You've taken something that can't be replaced." The officer didn't know what to say. He knew that words couldn't fix the situation, and he wasn't equipped to handle someone like this. He had only seen glimpses of what this man might be capable of, flashes of something much larger, much more dangerous than he could imagine. But he wasn't going to back down. Not yet. "We'll take care of the paperwork," the officer said, trying to sound reassuring but failing. We'll get everything sorted out and you'll have your chance to file a complaint. We'll... The man stood up abruptly, his movement swift and purposeful, and the officer instinctively took a step back. The man wasn't just reacting emotionally. He was calculating his next move. He wasn't a person who just got angry or lost control. He was someone who had spent his life in situations that required the highest level of control, even under pressure. "Don't try to fix this," the man said coldly. "You can't fix this. Not by filing papers or pretending like it didn't happen." He looked down at the dog one last time, his expression unreadable. Then he turned away from the officer and started walking down the street. The officer stood there stunned, unsure of what had just happened. He had no idea who this man was, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed paths with someone who wasn't just an ordinary civilian. The man didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew what was coming. He had seen it before. The world was full of people who didn't understand. People who made mistakes, people who would never see the full picture. But that was okay. He knew how to handle it. As he walked away, his mind was already racing, his thoughts focused on what he needed to do next. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The next day, the news began to spread. The story of the officer who shot the dog became a local sensation. People were outraged, demanding answers. How could something like this happen? How could an officer fire on an unarmed civilian's dog without provocation? The police department began their own investigation, but the details were murky. They didn't know the full story, and no one was sure what had led to the officer firing his weapon. Witnesses were conflicting in their accounts, and the department scrambled to put together a timeline. They had no idea that this would quickly become something far more complicated than a simple case of police misconduct. The man, meanwhile, kept to himself. He didn't want attention. He didn't want the media to get involved. All he wanted was justice, but justice in his terms, not in the way the system would handle it. He knew what he was capable of, and he also knew that the system was flawed, that the people in charge were just as much a part of the problem as the officers who made mistakes. But he wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. The officer who shot the dog began to feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He couldn't escape the realization that he had made a mistake. He was haunted by the look in the man's eyes, the quiet rage that he couldn't fully understand. He was just a cop doing his job. But something about the whole situation didn't sit right with him, and somewhere, deep down, he knew that the man he had just encountered was not someone who could easily be ignored. The officer had no idea that this was only the beginning of a much larger story, one that would shake the very foundation of what he thought he knew about law enforcement. Justice and the consequences of underestimating someone who had seen the darkest corners of the world. Days passed, but the anger and grief from the incident didn't fade. The man went about his life keeping to himself, doing what he could to stay under the radar, but the world around him was changing. The story of the dog's death had spread far beyond the small neighborhood. What had begun as a simple tragic mistake by a police officer was now part of a much larger conversation. The news outlets picked up the story, each one adding their own spin. Some focused on the police officer's actions, questioning why such a simple situation had escalated into violence. Others emphasized the man's calm demeanor, which seemed out of place given the circumstances. But none of the reports were getting the story right. They didn't understand the man, or the bond he had with his dog. They didn't understand what it meant to lose something like that. The police department had launched an internal investigation, but it was clear that they were struggling to piece together the details. The officers involved in the incident gave conflicting accounts, and witnesses were hesitant to speak out. It was obvious that no one was really sure what had gone wrong. The more the investigation dragged on, the more the media sensationalized the story, and through it all, the man remained silent. But he wasn't just sitting idly by. Behind the scenes, he had started making his own moves. He knew how the system worked, or rather, how it didn't work. The wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly, and justice was often a matter of who had the power to push it forward. And the man, a former Delta Force commander, knew that power wasn't always in the hands of the law. He didn't trust the police to handle the situation, not after what had happened. But he also knew he couldn't just let the incident slide. The dog's death had to mean something. It had to stand for something more than just a mistake made in a moment of fear. As the days dragged on, The officer who had fired the shot began to feel the pressure. The police department had assigned a few higher-ups to investigate the incident, but the officer couldn't escape the sense that something bigger was at play. The man he had shot at was no ordinary civilian. That much had become clear from the first moment they locked eyes. There was something about him that felt different. The officer had no idea who he was, but he knew he had messed up in a way that might come back to haunt him. The officer started to hear whispers among his colleagues. There were rumors that the man wasn't just some guy with a dog. Some said he was a former soldier. Others whispered about a secretive past, a life in the military that had been kept hidden. The officer had no way of confirming any of this, but the rumors made him uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man had been holding back, waiting for the right moment to reveal whatever it was he was hiding. The media continued to ask questions, but the police didn't have many answers. The man's identity remained a mystery, and despite the public outrage over the shooting, the case seemed to be stalled. The department was under pressure to do something, anything, to resolve the issue, but the truth was, they had no idea what had really happened. The man had just walked away, refusing to engage with anyone, and the officer who had fired the shot was beginning to crack under the strain. It was then that the man decided it was time to make his move. He knew that the public would never understand the full scope of what had happened unless he took matters into his own hands. He had nothing to lose, and he wasn't about to let a simple mistake ruin his life. The dog's death had left a hole in his heart, but it had also fueled a fire inside him. He was determined to get justice, but justice on his terms. The man started reaching out to a few trusted contacts, people who owed him favors from his time in the military. He wasn't looking for vengeance, not in the way most people would think. What he wanted was accountability. He wanted to make sure that the officer who had shot his dog, and anyone else involved, would understand the weight of their actions. He knew that the system wasn't going to give him what he needed, so he would have to make them listen. The man wasn't naive enough to think that he could take on the entire police force, but he had learned how to work from the shadows, how to get things done without drawing attention to himself. He didn't need to be a part of the system to make it work for him. He had seen how the game was played, and now he was going to play it on his terms. As he made his plans, the officer continued to struggle with the aftermath of the shooting. He couldn't sleep at night, haunted by the image of the man's face and the dog lying dead on the ground. He had never meant for it to go this far, but now he was part of a story much larger than he had ever imagined. Every time he stepped into his uniform, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. His colleagues offered their support, but it didn't ease the guilt that gnawed at him. Deep down, he knew that he had crossed a line, and that there was no going back. The officer's superiors started to take notice of his unease. They brought him in for a meeting to discuss the case, but the officer couldn't shake the feeling that they were more interested in covering their tracks than in finding the truth. They told him that the situation was being handled internally, but the officer couldn't help but wonder what was really going on behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the man was working behind the scenes to make sure the truth would come out. One way or another, he had already begun gathering information on the officer who had shot his dog, looking into his background, his record. He wasn't interested in ruining the officer's life, but he was determined to make sure the officer understood the consequences of his actions. The man had spent his life in a world where every decision had consequences, where every action could change the course of history. This was no different. As the investigation into the shooting continued, the man's quiet resolve became more apparent. The media had already painted him as a victim, but the truth was far more complicated than that. He wasn't just a victim. He was someone who had seen the darkest parts of the world and had learned how to survive in them. He had the skills, the experience, and the determination to make sure that the shooting didn't go unnoticed. The pressure was mounting on the police department. Public opinion was turning against them, and the department knew that they needed to act quickly to prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. They had hoped the story would die down, that the public would lose interest, but it wasn't happening. The officer who had shot the dog became a symbol of everything wrong with the system, and people weren't willing to let it go. And all the while, the man remained in the background watching, waiting for the right moment to reveal the full extent of his story. The police were starting to realize that they had made a mistake, but they didn't know how deep that mistake went. They had no idea who the man was or what he was capable of. But they would soon find out. The days turned into weeks, and the tension surrounding the shooting began to grow. The media circus had not slowed down. People were demanding answers, and the police department, scrambling to maintain control, found themselves stuck in a situation they hadn't been prepared for. The man who had remained out of the public eye had now become a figure of intrigue. No one knew much about him, but the rumors were spreading. He wasn't just anyone. He was a former soldier. Not just any soldier, but a member of Delta Force, one of the most elite and secretive units in the world. The officer who had shot the dog felt the weight of the world pressing down on him. He had never imagined that his simple mistake would lead to this. In his mind, it had been an accident. He hadn't meant to kill the dog, but it had happened, and now he was paying the price. He was no longer just a cop doing his job. He was the person who had made a huge mistake in front of the entire public. It wasn't just the media that was after him now. It was his own colleagues. People were starting to whisper, and the officer could feel their judgment every time he walked into the station. His once proud career was now under a microscope, and he knew that things would never be the same. As the investigation continued, the man made his presence known in subtle but unmistakable ways. He wasn't the type to speak out publicly, but he didn't need to. He was a man of action, not words. In the quiet corners of the city, behind closed doors, he was working with people who could help him get the answers he needed. He had connections, people who owed him favors from his time in the military, people who understood how to get things done when the system failed. He wasn't about to let this slip under the radar. He knew the officer's name, where he lived, everything about him. And now he was gathering information on the police department itself, looking for any cracks he could exploit. The police department, on the other hand, was scrambling. They had not expected this level of public outcry, and they had certainly not expected the quiet man they had encountered on that fateful night to turn into a figure that would keep them on edge. The department's internal investigation had stalled. No one could get a straight answer from the officers involved, and they weren't getting much cooperation from the witnesses either. There were too many conflicting stories. The officer who had shot the dog remained suspended, but that didn't seem to quiet the storm. The department's higher-ups knew they needed to act quickly before the situation spiraled out of control, but they weren't sure what direction to take. It was at this point that the truth about the man started to come out, slowly, almost like a whisper that was carried on the wind. It began with a report from a local journalist, someone who had been digging into the story and had managed to uncover bits and pieces of the man's past. What the journalist found shocked everyone. The man wasn't just a veteran. He was one of the most skilled, decorated soldiers the country had ever seen. Delta Force. The name alone was enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. These weren't just any soldiers. They were the best of the best, the ones sent on missions so dangerous that most people would never even hear about them. And the man standing before the officers, holding his dead dog, had once been at the heart of it all. The revelation hit like a storm. The news spread quickly, and the officer who had shot the dog felt his stomach drop. He hadn't known who he was dealing with that night, but now, the realization hit him full force. This wasn't just some random civilian. This was someone who had seen and done things most people couldn't even imagine, and now the officer had to live with the fact that he had shot this man's dog. He had no idea how deep the man's sense of justice ran, or what the consequences of his actions would be. But one thing was certain, the story was far from over. The public's reaction was swift and intense. Social media exploded with commentary, and the police department was flooded with calls and messages demanding accountability. People were furious, not just about the dog, but about the idea that an officer could shoot a person's pet without truly understanding who they were dealing with. The man's past was now an open secret, and the narrative shifted from the idea of a simple police mistake to something much larger. This was a story of a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country, a man who had seen the worst of humanity and come out the other side, only to have a simple encounter with law enforcement turn into a tragic event. The man, however, remained composed. He hadn't come forward with his identity for fame or attention. He hadn't wanted anyone to know who he was, but now that the truth was out, he could no longer stay silent. The officer who had shot his dog would have to answer for his actions. But the man wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge was a childish thing, and he was no longer a child. He had long since learned that the most powerful way to get justice was not through anger or violence, but through strategy, patience, and precision, and that was exactly what he planned to do. Behind closed doors, he began to use the connections he had. His old friends from the military were more than willing to help him, and they had their own ways of getting things done. He didn't need to make a public spectacle out of it. He wasn't trying to make the officer suffer. He just wanted to make sure the officer understood that there were consequences to his actions. And he wanted the public to know that sometimes, justice wasn't always something you could rely on the system to deliver. Sometimes you had to make it happen on your own terms. The officer, meanwhile, was dealing with his own fears. The media had painted him as the villain, and though he was just a man trying to do his job, he couldn't escape the crushing weight of what had happened. He knew the shooting had been a mistake, but he also knew that he couldn't take it back. The more he thought about it, the more the events of that night haunted him. His career was on the line, and he knew there were people out there who would stop at nothing to make him pay. He wasn't sure how much longer he could take the pressure. The department had kept him on administrative leave, but that didn't bring him peace. Every time he looked at his uniform, every time he put it on, he felt the weight of the shooting, the weight of his own regret. He had no idea what the man was capable of, but he knew that if the man wanted revenge, it would come. And there would be nothing anyone could do to stop it. The pressure from the public continued to mount. The police department, realizing that they couldn't simply let the matter fade away, began to make moves to settle things. But the man wasn't interested in a settlement. He wasn't interested in anything that could be easily forgotten. He wanted the officer to understand deeply what it meant to take the life of something that didn't deserve to die. As the weeks passed, the tension grew, and the man's next move became clearer. The time for patience had almost run out, but when it came, it wouldn't be in a way that anyone could predict. The final confrontation was coming, but no one knew how or when it would happen. All they knew was that the man had a plan. And when it came to someone like him, the last thing you wanted to do was underestimate it. The day had come. After weeks of tension, speculation, and quiet calculations, the man knew it was time to make his final move. He had let things unfold as they had, allowing the public to voice their outrage, the media to spread the story, and the police department to scramble in the face of mounting pressure. But now he was ready to take control of the narrative and ensure that his message was heard, loud and clear. He had made sure that everything was in place, every detail accounted for. He wasn't interested in revenge or violence, but he was determined to make sure the officer who had shot his dog understood the weight of his actions, and that the system which had failed him would learn something from the incident. He had done things his way, quietly and with precision as he always did. The officer, meanwhile, was nearing the breaking point. The suspension had been extended, and the police department was now publicly acknowledging that the situation was being handled by internal affairs. The officer could feel the walls closing in. He was no longer just a cop who had made a mistake. He was the embodiment of everything that was wrong with the system. The story of his mistake had become a symbol of police brutality, and no matter how much he tried to explain himself, there were no easy answers. But there was more at play than the officer realized. He had no idea how close the man was to making his move, or how deeply the man had been planning the course of events that had led them to this point. The man's past had remained a mystery to the public, but the officer now understood, if only in small glimpses, that the quiet, composed man was far from ordinary. He was someone who had seen and experienced things that most people could never understand, and that made him more dangerous than anything the officer had encountered before. The news had continued to report on the case, with coverage escalating as the investigation dragged on. The officer was still at the center of the story, but now the focus had shifted. The public was no longer just angry about the shooting. They were furious about the lack of transparency, about the idea that law enforcement could make a mistake like this and get away with it. People wanted accountability, and they wanted it fast. The police department was under immense pressure. Their internal investigation had hit a dead end, with no new information emerging from the officers involved or the witnesses. The situation was starting to feel like it might spiral out of control, and the department's higher-ups were growing nervous. They didn't want this to become another high-profile case that would make them look incompetent, but they didn't know how to resolve it either. They had no way of knowing that the real resolution was already in motion, and it wasn't going to come from them. It was late one evening when the man made his final move. He had decided that he would confront the officer directly, not in a violent way, but in a way that would leave a lasting impact. He wasn't going to let the officer off easy, and he wasn't going to allow the police department to sweep the incident under the rug. He had been patient, but the time for waiting was over. The officer was at home, sitting on his couch, staring blankly at the television. His mind was numb, and he hadn't been able to sleep properly for weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the dog's eyes staring back at him, and the image of the man's face, calm, composed, yet full of something he couldn't understand. Fear, perhaps, anger, certainly, but something deeper than that, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He had tried to put it out of his mind, but the guilt weighed on him constantly. The man had been right. He had made a mistake, a tragic one, and there was no going back. The officer heard a knock at the door. It wasn't the sound of someone casually stopping by. It was firm, deliberate, and it made him stiffen. His instincts kicked in, but when he opened the door, he wasn't prepared for what he would find. Standing in front of him was the man, the one from the street, the one who had walked away that night with his dog's body in his arms. He was calm, almost eerily so, his face unreadable. The officer's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he wasn't sure what to do. He had no idea how the man had found his home, how he had gotten past security. All he knew was that the man was standing there, and nothing was going to be the same after this moment. The officer's first instinct was to apologize again, to say that he was sorry for what had happened. But he could see in the man's eyes that words weren't going to fix this. Not anymore. "Come in," the officer said, his voice shaky. "We need to talk." The man didn't move right away. He just stood there, looking at the officer with a quiet intensity that made the officer feel small. After a few seconds, he stepped inside without a word. He didn't need to say anything. The officer knew that everything had led to this point, and that there was no easy way out. The man sat down in the living room, his posture relaxed but alert. He didn't speak right away, and the officer sat opposite him, unsure of how to proceed. The silence between them felt heavy, and the officer found himself struggling to breathe, as if the walls of the room were closing in on him. He had no idea what the man was going to do or say, but he knew that this was a conversation he would never forget. "I came to talk about the dog," the man finally said, his voice calm but firm. The officer nodded. "I know, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was an accident." The man didn't respond right away. He just looked at the officer, and in that moment, the officer felt like the man was seeing right through him, reading him in a way that he didn't understand. "An accident," the man said slowly. "But it's more than that, isn't it?" The officer blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" The man leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. "It's not just about the dog, is it? It's about everything. About the system that let this happen. About the way you saw me and my dog as a threat. You didn't even know who I was, and yet you made a decision that cost me something that can't be replaced. That's what this is really about." The officer swallowed hard, feeling a lump form in his throat. He didn't know how to respond. He had never been forced to confront the deeper layers of his own actions before. "I didn't know," the officer said quietly. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what your background was. I was just doing my job." "And your job," the man interrupted, "was to make a decision in a moment of fear. You weren't thinking about who I was or what I had been through. You were thinking about yourself, about protecting yourself." The officer felt a sharp sting of guilt, but he didn't know how to explain it. He hadn't been thinking about the man's past or his experience or the life he had led. He had been thinking about the situation in front of him, about the dog, about the commands, about the fear that had made him pull the trigger. The man stood up, his movements calm and measured. He looked at the officer one last time, his eyes hard but not without a sense of finality. "This is over now," the man said, "but you'll never forget this. You'll never forget what it means to make a mistake when you don't know who you're dealing with. And maybe, just maybe, you'll think twice next time." Without another word, the man turned and walked out of the officer's home, leaving the officer standing there, haunted by the encounter. He didn't know if he would ever fully understand the weight of what had happened, but one thing was clear. His life, and the way he saw the world, would never be the same again.